Hello and welcome to Ignite News Budget in Focus, the preview. Guyana's 2026 national budget will be presented in the National Assembly on January 26, coming at a critical moment, 5 years into the oil economy, following national elections and amid growing public expectations about what development should look like. Over the past 5 years, Guyana's national budgets have grown significantly, reflecting the country's rising oil revenues from approximately 329 billion Ghana dollars in 2020 to more than 1.3 trillion in 2025, funding major infrastructure projects, social programs, and economic initiatives. Here to help us put these numbers in perspective is Richard Rambarran, an economist with extensive experience in commerce, finance, public policy, and development. Together, we're taking a step back to examine what the budgets from 2020 to 2025 actually delivered and looking ahead to what Guyanese can realistically expect from Budget 2026. So Richard, thank you so much for deciding to join us to edify us on the National Budget 2026 and, give Guyanese a glimpse of what we can expect. How are you doing?
I'm doing well so far. Thank you, of course, for having me. And it's certainly a pleasure to be back here with the team at Ignite News. And I think you guys have been doing fantastic work, so continue to keep it up.
Oh, we feel so nice. All right. So let's get into the interview.
Sure.
Guyana has seen significant changes in our economic structure since 2020. Since the emergence of oil. As an economist deeply involved in both the private and public sector, how would you say or how would you characterize the general trajectory of budgets from 2020 to 2025?
Sure. So the general trajectory of budgets from 2020 until 2025 follows a broad pattern that is commensurate with the economic growth. Mm-hmm. That is to say, really, if you look at the explosive rates that we've been having in economic growth, double-digit rates of growth, you'll find that the budgets grow, rightfully so, in a concomitant fashion. So larger economy, more revenues available, more resources being discovered, bearing fruit of investments of previous budgets. Mm-hmm. You would find that every successive budget will continue to be larger. One can reasonably anticipate, Ramona, that 2026 budget, which is to be presented shortly in the National Assembly, mm-hmm. will be, once again, the largest budget in the history of Guyana.
And would you say the past budgets have been shaped more by economic strategy, immediate pressures, or political priorities?
So it's always a nexus of all three. You can't really identify that there is one particular overtone that exists. So if you think about yourself in a policy-making position, you would want to ensure that you are able to balance all three and that the synergies of it working together, all three of those factors that you would have mentioned, mm-hmm. that they exist. So firstly, when a government or a governmental hopeful goes to the electorate, mm-hmm. they are outlining what they will be doing over a particular period of time. That is to say, they're 5 years in office. So governments, when elected into office, governments, once they are responsible and accountable to the electorate, they tend broadly to follow the promises that they would have given on the campaign trail. And so the manifesto of a political party, when they enter into government, would always tend to have an influence into the fiscal program year to year, reflected, of course, in the budget. Immediate pressures, any government that is caring about the populace will always undertake measures which can also respond mm-hmm. to the immediacy and to the lived environment and the lived economic reality of Guyanese. So if you think about the confluence of those two, mm-hmm. you ought generally to be influenced by it. And then you would have mentioned the third. The third is?
Political priorities.
Political priorities. So political priorities, you'll find governments always, as I would have mentioned, been based on their manifestos and so forth. But I think you also mentioned strategy, economic strategy. So economic strategy, you tend to respond to both the domestic as well as the international economic realities. And you cannot have a well-timed, well-placed, well-responsive budget without considering all three of the factors: economic, political, and immediacy. You can't have a thorough understanding of a well-timed budget and the presentation of one without due consideration of all three, and it being crafted as a result of the confluence of the three.
All right, so let's talk about your observances in terms of spending patterns and how they align with those three pillars: economic strategy, political priorities, and immediacy.
Good. So that's an excellent follow-up question. So if you think about, for example, the world that the current administration entered into in 2020, besieged by global pandemic, having a major impact on consumption patterns, and really a total decline in aggregate demand based on what was happening. Therefore, the budget that came during that period had to necessarily respond to the prevailing circumstances. And so you would have seen cash stimulus, injections to the economy through cash stimulus that had a particular intention of increasing aggregate demand. As we move along, just so that we can not get too tied up in all of the intricacies, as you move along during that period, you move from issues in the demand side of the economy by way of contractions in aggregate demand into supply side issues. So recall that we would have had several issues globally. The issue with the Suez Canal, shipping trauma from China, the massive rise in inflation of the transport cost from China. And what we found at that particular time is that the budget responded to what was happening as a result of that. So we saw a reversion of the prices for freight to pre-pandemic levels, etc. As you move along the continuum of time, where we are today is a world that is very, very much different from a world in 2020. And you find that because we are coming out of the COVID period, there's global pressure that is applied on aggregate demand within a world sense. And what that does is that coming out of the pandemic, coming out of that era, coming out of fixing supply chain issues, which some still linger, you find that there is much need to ensure that inflation is tempered, that prices of imported commodities do not run away from the local consumption patterns. You find that there is a need to ensure that we can continue to temper the rates of freight that exists from China to Guyana. So some of what we can anticipate in this budget would be not only to attack some of the political promises that were made in 2025, the campaign for the second term which this administration has, but also to tackle some of the big issues that we are facing, which not only impacts Guyana, but has an issue within the Western Hemisphere. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done, and there's a fair bit that the budget I look forward to being crafted to ensure that we can curtail some of those economic issues that we are seeing.
Okay, in terms of government sector allocations over the last 5 years, in terms of social programs, infrastructure, public sector support, what trends were obvious to you?
So one of the major ones, and I think it's been a hot button, quote-unquote, topic, has been the continued and consistent investment in infrastructure. Not just infrastructure in terms of general roads and bridges, but infrastructure from a capital expenditure standpoint in education, the education sector. We see a number of new schools being built. We see a number of refurbishments and renovations happening. Capital expenditure from the point of healthcare. We see a number of new hospitals being built. We see a number of medical centers being reconstructed, refurbished, renovated. Also, the investments from a capital expenditure standpoint in the housing sector. I think the government of Guyana has reported tens of thousands, upward, I believe, of 30,000 homes that have been constructed during the period of time. So a clearly emerging pattern is an emphasis on infrastructure and this very strong and rightly so injection into longer term investments from this windfall oil revenue which we have gotten. And I say rightly so because I personally believe that when you look at resource-rich developing economies around the world, there can be an obvious tendency by governments to go the politically popular route, increase salaries by 20% every year, double social expenditure, that is to say doubling on welfare payouts, giving unbridled cash grants continuously. That's a term which has become very popular now here in Guyana. And that proclivity to be fiscally irresponsible and the temptation to be fiscally irresponsible tends to exist in economies such as ours, where you have this deficit of infrastructure, this high demand for consumption, a real need for social welfare to be continuously addressed. You find that there is a temptation. And from my understanding of economies that have been able to do it successfully, one of the key drivers has really been the investment into long-term infrastructure. The gestation period of the investment in infrastructure can be a long time. That is to say, you may not see the immediate returns from investing in new bridges. You may not see the immediate returns or the immediate relief from investing in new schools. But what you do see is that over a period of time, the economic and social benefits that accrue as a result of these investments, the multiplier that they can have over time lasts much longer and is much stronger in the way that it diffuses into the economy than maybe just, say, a one-off cash grant. So those are some of the major trends that I've been seeing, and it really is to, in my view, the government's credit that we have gone that route as opposed to the fiscally tempting thing to do.
So you mentioned that the intent of the trends seem to be long-term investment. But you also mentioned fiscally responsible, tying that to cash grants. But one can also argue that infrastructure, which, as you said, gestational period may take longer in some cases. I've seen instances where you might a road may take a year to finish, but then at the end of that year, there's need for significant repairs to that road. Now, if you're telling me, we were speaking layman, if you're telling me you spend so long to build a quality road with the intent of long-term investment, then is it not fiscally irresponsible to have to start back to do repairs on that road that took however long to complete?
Yeah, so that's a very important observation. And when you see volumes increasing to the level that they increase in Guyana, you take our infrastructure budget, which we have now, and you track back the size of the budget maybe in 2014, and you look at just our infrastructure budget now. if I'm not mistaken, it is just about the same size. But if you think about our population, you think about our workforce, you think about our institutional capacity to monitor, etc., it has not drastically increased from the same period. So it's like we're trying to run an economy in the same, with the same workforce, the same types of technologies being employed, but scaling it up in an exponential way. And so you will find these teething issues, Ramona. You will find that if I'm doing 20 roads in 1 year, and in 2 years I'm doing 2,000 roads, whereas when I was doing 20, I had a 0.5% issue. It might not show up, perhaps only in one road. But if I scale that up to 2,000 roads, and I have a 0.5% issue or failure rate, or a 0.5% where you're having these sorts of issues, you'll find that when you scale it to 2,000 roads, the issues that we're talking about will show up much more. And so one has to necessarily examine the scale of what we have been doing historically, and putting it alongside the scale of what we're doing now, and realize that we exist in a modern Guyana where it's moved from whether we can do it to how do we ensure that we do this the best. There was a point in time in Guyana, in the public discourse, that the discussions were around how do we finance with this, with monies that are coming on board now. The discussion moves away from how do we finance to how do we get best value. And so an appreciation of that transformation, and an appreciation of the fact that broadly we're dealing with the same workforce and the same institutional capacity also has to be taken on board when making those sorts of assessments. And so we also have a modern culture, not unique to Guyana, where we tend to spotlight on negatives. And so if I do, let's use same 2,000 roads, if I do 1,500 roads right,
you'll only focus on the
and I do
negative.
500 roads wrong,
That is human nature.
focus on the 500 roads. And so that is something too we need to be guarded against, I believe, as a Guyanese populace, about sensationalism of the outliers, and really take a step back, take a macroscopic view, and observe the scale of what is happening, observe the general trends, and look at if, as a country, we are moving the needle forward. I think that is one of the key things that we need to observe.
Okay. So how would you say then that, how would you say Guyana has managed its oil resources so far, and what lessons can policymakers carry into Budget 2026?
Sure. So Guyana's oil revenue management has to be understood within the context of the institutional architecture that has been created for it. We could have gone the route as a country of not implementing a sovereign wealth fund and have all of the monies straight into the consolidated fund, not being stored in any sort of account, not being invested into any instruments, and we could have just continued to spend 100% of the funds 100% of the time. If we look at what we have, we actually have a natural resources fund which has been established, revised to be strengthened, one which, when we look at it as the Santiago principles, we see that it is a firm contender for checking almost all of the boxes within the Santiago principles, as the Santiago principles on best practices for sovereign wealth funds. And if we observe how budgeting is done, there is a need every single time that monies are withdrawn for that to be made public and approved. So from the very outset, the mechanism that has been established for spending of oil revenues, that has to be appreciated. There are many countries, Ramona, historically, that have faced what we have faced. That is to say, discoveries of massively viable commercial quantities of petroleum, who have existed for 2-3 decades with oil production, then establish a sovereign wealth fund. So that is an important starting point for anyone who wants to understand what is happening in the economy for them to fully appreciate. Secondly, the rate at which monies are being extracted and the timing of when it's being extracted also helps in economic management. So we could have been in a position where all the funds are going into the consolidated fund, and then they are being programmed at the beginning of the year with the budget, and then just being spent throughout the year. What the government of Guyana is doing by way of the sovereign wealth fund is ensuring that when monies go into the fund, you program along with the budget, but then you have residual in the fund to be able to help with macroeconomic stabilization and also help to spur along or catalyze rates of commerce as the economy goes through its boom-bust cycles throughout the year. So you can have periods, for example, where the economy is teetering along and the government recognizes this. And so in an upcoming quarter, monies are being extracted from the sovereign wealth fund to aid in smoothing out that volatility that exists in the economic cycle. Which is why if we think about commercial responses or responses by persons engaged in the commercial sector, you hardly find people complaining that it is a difficult time at this point and we're just waiting for a holiday season or an upsurge. Part of that has to do with smoothing out the business cycle and the economic volatilities that exist and what is called the lumpiness of capital. When you program money into an economy, that it exists in big lumps and that in itself influences the rate of commerce and the commercial cycles. So those are very important points to note, and I would say the pattern of management of the revenues thus far, they've been responsible, and we as an economy can actually account for what we have been seeing coming in as a country simply because everything has to be reported.
Okay, so are there risks we should be cognizant of in terms of spending pace and oil revenue reliance?
Yeah, so that is important. There is always a strong risk that exists when one has large amounts of cash available and at disposal. If you think about even a personal example where you may have a massive amount of cash that perhaps you've inherited or you won a lotto, you won a lottery, and you have this massive amount of cash, there can be a proclivity to be irresponsible with it, and then that in itself acts as a risk. What is important is that there are strong risk mitigants that exist, and we manage within a risk architecture. So going back to your question, I want to answer exactly. Just repeat exactly what you.
What are the risks we should be cognizant of in terms of spending, pacing, and oil revenue reliance?
Good. So if one thinks about that, we have a situation where investment in infrastructure and pushing along capital expenditure can be seen as, from time to time, perhaps inducing inflationary impacts. And that always exists as a risk. One cannot run away from it. It is an economic fact. But if we are able to understand over a fiscal year what that program of work looks like, and we are able to manage through different project cycles, through different program cycles, what that looks like, then we'd be in a much stronger position to be able to evaluate and understand. In Guyana, we have a national procurement and tender board, which is managed under the auspices of a board of directors and falls within the purview of the Ministry of Finance. And the two work almost in sync to ensure that when the pace of the project cycle is too slow and it has a drag impact, a fiscal drag, or a commercial drag rather in the economy, that we do deliberate things to accelerate that pace. Usually, if it starts to push too fast, too hard, there can be a tendency to then slow that pace down to ensure that you don't have an economy that is overheating. So yes, those are the domestic circumstances or the domestic environment which can impact on, in an inflationary sense, and presents itself actually as a challenge. Then on the flip side, we also do have this very real issue of imported inflation, where our consumption basket in Guyana, if you think about what you put on your plate in the morning, or if you think about the 10 standard items that you would buy in a household, a majority of that consumption basket is imported, which means fundamentally we do not have within our economic levers to pull too many to be able to control that. If we think about imported inflation going alongside an economy that may have a tendency to overheat if you push it too hard, then you are in a situation where it has to be carefully managed. And so that, I would say, represents one of the major risks that you can observe. And if we think about what we have been seeing thus far, as a country, when we put our rates of inflation alongside Caribbean, hemispheric, and global inflation, at each point in time over the past 5 years, every single quarter, we have always been below all three of those metrics. So, once again, it's to the credence of proper fiscal management and being able to smooth out the boom-bust cycles and being able to understand when to pull the levers to tighten and when to push the lever to be able to expand.
Okay, so as we know, part of economic transformation is how the budget would normally affect private sector and local businesses. So let's touch on that. What are the effects?
Sure. So the budget is an extremely anticipated tool in the life of private sector folks. Why? Because it represents new opportunities for contracts. It represents new opportunities for relief for consumers. Relief in consumers translates into spending power within the economy. It also represents a potential for tax breaks. It also represents measures which may help to relieve burdens that have been in the economy. It also represents a direction by the government, a broad signal in the economy to understand what is their intention in the upcoming year. And that also helps the private sector to be able to program their calendar of activity. And so the government actually presenting the budget so early on in the year firstly, is an excellent point because it gives, from a private sector lens, more time to be able to play with in terms of understanding clearly what the signals are for the upcoming year. So it's a highly anticipated document or program of work by the government. And I can tell you, every year the government of Guyana engages with the private sector. I think you would have recently seen Dr. Singh put on his public pages that they would have engaged with the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce, Private Sector Commission, the Manufacturing Association, and other representative bodies, because it has to be a collaborative effort to ensure that the areas and the measures which are needed to facilitate and engender private sector growth is undertaken. I am very happy that there is an embrace of the private sector. I am very happy that there is an embrace of the creative economy, and that we are also beginning to build out away from just primary sectors and away from heavy industrial sectors, that we are also having a simultaneous build out of what we call the orange economy, and happening simultaneously with the low carbon or the preservation of our low carbon, and Guyana continuing to be a net carbon sink. So if we think about it, we are really at the point that we are strongly having a nexus between these three main pillars of our economy, or what can be referred to in an economic sense as growth poles within our economy. So that sends a very clear signal to the private sector that we are looking at the creative economy, we're looking at the preservation of our forests through the low carbon development strategy alongside agriculture, and then looking at heavy industries such as the continued transformation of the energy sector, infrastructure, social sectors with investment in healthcare, education, etc. So those three represent a very good and strong signal to the private sector.
So tying into the growth polls you mentioned, in terms of financial sector development and better access to finance to support competitiveness,
Yes.
How would you say the budget policy has helped or hindered this goal?
All right. So I know that we're talking, of course, here about budget, but the budget operationalizes the government's policies in this regard. Because remember what the budget is. It's really a program of work for monies for the government throughout the year. But if you think about the heels upon which it comes, last October, late October, early November, the government of Guyana would have, through His Excellency the President announced that there is an intention to develop the capital markets in Guyana and to create a junior stock market. One of the main things that I am anticipating in this upcoming budget is that there is financial sector development, and more particularly what is termed financial deepening, by way of the implementation of this program of work for capital market development, and particularly seen undertaking this junior stock market. Because what it does, Ramon, is that it unleashes an area or an avenue of capital that really is dormant in Guyana. We see large amounts of excess liquidity sitting in the commercial banks, which consumers, households, savers, they put there. And the banks are intermediating those funds to lend in almost a risk-free fashion, because they're still asking people for, immovable property to be put as collateral, though there have been some changes in recent time to government policy to help with that. But that area is one that is needed. The unlocking of household savings and consumer savings in commercial banks into viable investments in the economy. And the junior stock market allows for that. A junior stock market will allow micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, enterprises who cannot list on the existing exchange because they don't reach that threshold. But if we can demonstrate that we are responsible companies with strong corporate governance, a commitment to growth and transparency, we can list on the junior stock market. When listing on the junior stock market, we are then placed in a position that as a Guyanese populace, we can look at these companies and invest into these companies. And this is an area that, Ramona, is desperately needed in Guyana. I think we would have all seen recently on social media that there was a social media commentator that exposed a recent pyramid scheme in Guyana. And this is not the first of its kind. This is perhaps the second or third in the past 5 years that has made its way into the public domain in such a large and swashbuckling fashion. We would all remember accelerated finance at the turn of the decade with this fella Yuri or whatever his name was, who was saying bring 2 people and whatever. I saw questions on social media talking about why are Guyanese so gullible? Why are Guyanese always falling for this? But if we think about the standard Guyanese consumer, if you are working your job and you have your savings, other than putting it into the commercial bank, what else do you have to do to put it into a passive form of investment? And all of them tie into each other. You place your funds into the commercial banks. The commercial banks end up with a whole heap of excess liquidity. They then take a risk-free intermediation of that fund and give it to private sector at a spread, which is a very healthy spread. And then you are left with 0.25% on your savings rate per annum. If in Guyana we had an avenue for unleashing that excess liquidity, the tens of thousands of persons who would be saving their monies in the commercial banks, instead of doing that, they're putting it into investment vehicles that can earn them passive rates of interest. That in itself helps to unlock an entire new method of financing projects, of financing enterprises, and for supporting MSME growth. So the entire nexus that exists there is one which I look forward to Budget 2026 addressing, especially contingent on the fact that His Excellency the President has spoken about this and has given a public commitment to ensure capital market development and the establishment of the junior stock exchange in Guyana.
And I do agree that also investment education would assist with youth employment.
Yes.
Largely
Yes.
in Guyana. So growth figures can be impressive, but people feel costs in their daily lives.
Yes.
I know you've been hearing people saying the economy is so high and, So with notable GDP growth in recent years, including some months showing nearly 50% growth, how well has it translated into improved living standards and reduced cost of living expenses, according to you?
Yes, of course, all of this is my opinion, Ramona, and backed by my analysis of the data. So, is one that one has to be cognizant of. It's an area that one has to be cognizant of. Why do I say alongside an economy feature of inflation? Because if one thinks about the driver of inflation, it is really too much money chasing too few goods. That really is what inflation is. Too much money chasing too few goods. And if you are at a point where monies have occurred in your economy in a windfall fashion, and your private sector has not been able to produce the value of goods and services too, but the value more particularly of goods and commodities to match that windfall that has occurred to the economy, you can end up in inflationary situations. Which is why, Ramona, from a macroeconomic management perspective, it is not by happenstance that you see this emphasis on private sector. Because we do need in Guyana to have the private sector come up to speed to be able to help to offset that tendency of imported inflation to have an impact differing in our economy. Going back to the same example that I just gave you, if we did not have reconstituted milk being produced locally by DDL, and we only had to depend, or we solely had to depend on imported milk, imported reconstituted milk from a country like Trinidad, that would mean that every consumer would have to bear the brunt of that country's economic circumstances, a shipping rate which has nothing to do with Guyana's domestic environment, and also the duties and taxes that exist to be paid on that. That concrete example demonstrates why this abstract notion of private sector growth is so important and underpins sound macroeconomic management. Because if we have more DDLs, if we have micro enterprises that are able to grow into industries that can tangibly offset that notion of imported inflation, you'll find that Guyanese consumers will face a much easier time. Let me give another very clear example. Umami ketchup or
Pepper,
Rixansari ketchup versus some other brand. I can call maybe say Heinz, because of course that's a big global brand and we have it here. If you think about the consumer basket and the decisions that have to be made then, and you look at the price difference, you will note that the price difference will reflect an absence of imported inflation. So those are two important elements of inflation couched: international, domestic conditions, and then what the budget can do. Let me deal with what the budget can do as being the third.
And let me just interject. So, based on the reasoning you just gave, I understand what you're saying. However, one can argue though quality versus cost. So, I mean, yes, we do have local products. We can opt for local products at a lower cost. And in many instances, when we opt for the foreign brands, where it's self-imposed inflation, right? However, again, we can argue quality versus cost. So then we should be encouraging our local branders, our local entrepreneurs, to step up their game in some instances.
Are you sure you're not an economist? Because this is exactly where I was going about Budget 2026 and what it can do to help to mitigate that. Now, if there are programs there that can help to support quality and assurances of standard and the output from those local manufacturers, local producers, and also be able to help them scale simultaneously with for example, a junior stock market, then you are looking at an economy where the fortunes for an average consumer can change or transform very quickly.
You're leveling the playing field.
You're helping to, I won't want to say level the playing field, but you are helping to lift the standard of domestic enterprises. And really that is where, from a philosophical standpoint, we must aim for. We must aim for domestic industries to be internationally competitive, to be of an international standard. Take, for example, the entire discussion around local content. The government of Guyana is going to be soon, perhaps within this quarter, they've indicated revising the targets for local content. Part of that discussion must also lie with the private sector about how do they not just capture the value chain that is here, but also help to build an internationally competitive private sector. And so from that vantage point, we must ensure that what we are doing here in Guyana in the private sector is also of an internationally competitive sense. So reconstituted milk that is being produced in Guyana must be able to be internationally competitive. If you think about lettuce, for example, that CV Farms is producing, or the other folks that produce out of Queenstown, they must be of also equally a high quality, like the Caribbean counterparts, because there is only so much of the quality price trade-off that a consumer will make. You might not want to take, and I'll just give an example, you might not want to be drinking cow's milk out of a recycled chubby bottle, but you will take the reconstituted milk from DDL in a nicely packaged Tetra Pak. And so a big part of the discussion also has to be, how do we support the domestic private sector having better standards, better quality, being internationally competitive, and then also Budget 2026 continuing to address some of the structural challenges that impact on the cost of production and the cost of doing business in Guyana. Take, for example, one, cost of electricity. You'll find a much transformed Guyanese private sector when the cost of electricity reduces through the completion of the gas to energy project. You will find a much more competitive Guyanese private sector and better quality when the reliability of electricity improves, or when access to finance improves by financial institutions taking more risk in their lending, or growth being unlocked through a new development in a financial sector such as a junior stock market. And so, Ramona, we cannot view these developments in isolation. One has to understand that the prevailing reality that you see is not one that is only or solely at the feet of one program of work by the government. It has to also be seen within a broader context. Global developments, Caribbean developments, structural issues that we face, and also how much can be done through one fiscal year, one program of work.
Okay, so let's lean into Budget 2026. Let me pick your brain for predictions. Based on our current macroeconomic situation and past budget trends, patterns, what or where would you say or think the largest allocations may be in this 2026 budget?
So some of the largest allocations, that's a good question. I'd reckon to be in health, education, agriculture / agro processing in and around that area, housing once again, and then infrastructure in the transportation sector. So once again, massive investments in roads, continuing to expand highways, major bridges, etc. I want to touch, Ramona, on something which is pertinent to that, and it's referred to as the programming of the budget by government. You know, there's been a slang now that is being tossed around, talking about people can't eat roads. That one I find to be very interesting, right? But if you don't have roads, people can't eat, right? Because how is the farmer getting his stuff out? And that infrastructure work as being the great equalizer within a country which is of a geographic mass. I want to frontally address this discussion of programming in the budget, because there seems to be a tendency to run away with, we're investing too much in capital expenditure. If one takes, and I worked with some numbers just to highlight what I'm saying. If one looks at the 2022 budget, you'll see, and this is taken from Appendix D of Volume 1 of the National Accounting Estimates, you'll see capital expenditure for that year being 234 billion and current expenditure being 312 billion. That gives us a ratio of 0.75, which essentially means that for every dollar that the government is spending, 75 cents is being spent on capital expenditure. In 2023, we see the amounts moving from to 395 billion in capex as against 368 billion for current expenditure, which we see capex now overtaking current expenditure. And that gives us a ratio of 1.07, which essentially means that for every dollar that the government is spending on current expenditure, they are spending 7 cents more on capex. For 2024, that ratio goes to 1.48, which means, of course, for every dollar that's being spent, 1.48 or 1.5, $1.50. And then for 2025, that comes down to 1.22. The reason I highlight this is to demonstrate that though you may be seeing the number growing in an absolute sense, you cannot take the number in isolation. The number has to be viewed relative to the growth too in current expenditure. And we don't see that occurring here. You actually do see an increase, and that infrastructure work as being the great equalizer within a country which is of a geographic mass. I want to frontally address this discussion of programming in the budget because there seems to be a tendency to run away with we're investing too much in capital expenditure. If one takes, and I worked with some numbers just to highlight what I'm saying. If one looks at the 2022 budget, you'll see, and this is taken from Appendix D of Volume 1 of the National Accounting Estimates, you'll see capital expenditure for that year being 234 billion and current expenditure being 312 billion. That gives us a ratio of 0.75, which essentially means that for every dollar that the government is spending, 75 cents is being spent on capital expenditure. In 2023, we see the amounts moving from to 395 billion in capex as against 368 billion for current expenditure, which we see capex now overtaking current expenditure. And that gives us a ratio of 1.07, which essentially means that for every dollar that the government is spending on current expenditure, they are spending 7 cents more on capex. For 2024, that ratio goes to 1.48, which means, of course, for every dollar that's being spent, 1.48 or 1.5, $1.50. And then for 2025, that comes down to 1.22. The reason I highlight this is to demonstrate that though you may be seeing the number growing in an absolute sense, you cannot take the number in isolation. The number has to be viewed relative to the growth too in current expenditure. And we don't see that occurring here. You actually do see an increase, and then a decrease. I personally think, my professional assessment of it is that if you program capital works, and your capital works, remember, sometimes it may take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. If you program capital works, important capital works, and rightly so, in your budget, and this gestation period continues, then you will see successive budgets having a decrease in that capital expenditure relative to its growth in previous years. Why that is important is that one has to recognize that there will be some years where CapEx is going to appear much larger than it has been in previous years. And that is important to underscore this point, that investments in capital works in Guyana is needed. It will take some time for it to be done, but we as Guyanese have to also be appreciative of the fact that these things are being done. So I wanted to highlight that because there is a tendency for these accusations and for these very catchy song bites to take off, emboldened in various media houses. And taking the facts is an important part of it all.
All right, so you touched on some of the areas of spending that may be considered most crucial for development. How about policy? What other areas do you deem crucial for sustained growth and social impact?
Sure. So sustained growth, social impact. Sustained growth, I really would like to see continued investment in the agriculture sector and support for agri and ag tech. That is the infusion of technology into the agriculture sector and advancing the agro-processing sector in Guyana. The reason I say that is we can help to mitigate cost of living issues in Guyana, and we can help to curtail impacts from global inflation, domestic weather pattern issues, droughts, excessive rainfall, etc. If we have a better equipped, more technologically infused, and well-rounded agriculture sector that understands the business of agri. And so I hope and look forward to continued investments in the agriculture sector. I also do look forward to more improvements and transformative investments in the energy sector as well as the infrastructure sector. I believe that those are works in progress. And when the story of Guyana's economic history is written, this period of time and this level of investment being made will be seen as landmark. So I look forward to those two, particularly along the line of social, sustainable growth. And then you would have mentioned social impacts. So I believe that the point of untethered cash transfers has to be managed carefully. And we have to really understand, as a country, if unconditional, all-encompassing cash grants is where we want to be, or do we look at more targeted forms of relief? That is to say, perhaps for teachers and public servants who are able to implement their program of work. Or what about private sector workers who are helping to steward the economy along, and perhaps something for them? Or do we continue to look at, not because it's not done in isolation, or it has never been done in Guyana, do we continue to look at support for single parent families? Do we continue to look at vulnerable groups that exist in Guyana? And so we must observe carefully whether the patterns which emerge and the willingness to work, the willingness to engage in job seeking and job search activities, whether that culture is being impacted by unconditional cash transfers and anticipatory cash transfers. There was a point in time where, for Christmas seasons, there was the joint services bonus that was being given and the retroactive salary increases. Now I see Christmas 2025. There seems to have been government of Guyana taken to slaughterhouse because there was seemingly an understanding, some sort of tacit understanding by Guyanese that there was going to be a cash transfer being given at Christmas, in spite of an explicit promise not being made. That actually curtailed a lot of Christmas consumer spending in anticipation of that cash grant. What did it do to commerce during that period is something which perhaps we can use as an example as to why anticipatory effects in the economy through cash grant expectation may not necessarily be a good thing. So
it's not sustainable.
Not sustainable, but also not the type of culture that you want to develop for your consuming populace as one aspect, and then for your broader economy and macroeconomic management. I'll give an example of our sister country, Trinidad. Find out from policymakers in Trinidad and the private sector how extraordinarily difficult it has been to get people back out to work post-COVID in Trinidad. And you will see that what is called in labor economics the incentive to work and the incentive to engage in job seeking and productive activities, what that has done. And so we ought to ask ourselves as a consuming populace if that is a road that we want to go. If it is a road that we want to go, then we must be prepared to also accept simultaneously the consequences that go along with it. That is to say, if I anticipate as a private sector, as a business owner or as a shopkeeper, that come the first of every month,
exactly, yes,
we are going to have $1,000 being dispensed to each and every person in the economy over 18 years old. Well, we must also understand that the shopkeeper reserves a right to increase his prices during the first of every month and eat away at the real value of what your $1,000 might be. What the broader economic impact of that may be, Ramona, is something that the tale has been told several times through countries' experiences. And so, whilst I am not against unilateral transfers, there ought to be more consideration given to unconditional unilateral transfers and whether that is a good thing for the Guyanese economy or if it destroys what we call the incentive schema to work and to engage in productive activities.
In a sense, it would be better to have working forms of income as compared to one-off cash grants.
Yes, or for example, how about the people who have been working all year in the private sector in good media houses or in good television stations? How about looking at something targeted for them during a particular period of time and using the same monies which would have been paid out in cash and just simply view it as non-revenue earning from corporate tax during that period. And so we really need to question how strongly we want to implement some of these things in the economy. And we need to ensure that the signals that we are sending are strong, credible signals, and that Guyanese understand what is happening. Because a major part of public policy, Ramona, it's not just about what you do, but it's about the communication of what you do, the messaging of what you do. You take a track back to Mia Motley and what she had to do in Barbados with the implementation of the IMF program in 2018, 2019, etc. And look at how she did public communication for a very painful piece of public policy. I believe it was taking away subsidies from minibuses, from their big buses that they have, their metro system which they have, and what happened there. I believe it's that, but you look at the way that it was framed and the way that Barbadians understood what needed to happen. And so we also must understand as Guyanese people, if we want to go a particular route, what are the implications that ensue when we go that route?
All right, I agree. All right, so before we close, I want us to give our viewers a sort of checklist in anticipation of Budget Presentation 2026 tomorrow, January 26th. As the budget is presented, what are the key indicators, or what are some key indicators that the public should pay attention to?
Yeah, so some of the key indicators are firstly, the budget really will be divided into three main parts. And so let's walk it through. Firstly is a retrospect on 2025. Let's pay attention to what happened in the economy in 2025 in that section. Reporting on the economy in 2025. Secondly, there will be the program of work for each of the sectors. Pay attention to what the sizes of the allocations are and the emphasis which is being placed on which sector, but also which subsector. Try to get your hands, if you can, on the Ministry of Finance's national estimates. They're on the website, finance.gov.gy, on the estimates, and you can download that if you want to see in detail what it is. But you can also go through the budget speech just for quick reporting, which can also be found on the same website. So that's the second segment. And then the third important segment is around measures and policies. These are the parts where people really like to hear from, and that's at the back of the budget speech coming down to the last end. So that's an important aspect. And in anticipation of that, one should ensure that as soon as you get a copy of the budget speech, that you can go through that segment and look at it very clearly. So if we are to look at a checklist, there are three broad things that you must be looking for. One is the performance of what happened in 2025, because it's important to understand how the economy performed, what the allocations are in 2026, both from a sectoral level, that is to say broadly agriculture, manufacturing, transport, etc., and then from a subsector level too, which may represent fresh crops, other crops, livestock, fishing, logging, etc. So it's important to understand those. And then as a third aspect of your checklist, to really look at the measures and policies that exist. Some of the key indicators, statistics to pay attention to would be economic growth, would be the level of inflation, would also be the level of public sector investment spending that was achieved last year. That is to say, how much of the capital expenditure has been spent. And then also, in terms of key indicators, what the rates of growth are expected to be for the various sectors in the upcoming year. That will tell you which of the sectors are anticipated to be high growing sectors or high performing sectors in the upcoming year. So those are some of the key metrics to pay attention to.
What about measures?
All right. So measures is the big thing that everybody always looks forward to. So measures I look forward to, or what people should perhaps look forward to, that may impact their lives the most. Whether there are personal income tax reductions, whether there are any corporate tax reductions, whether there are reliefs that exist for the private sector on freight, etc. The reason why for that measure is that it can directly translate into monies in the pockets of people. The anticipated raises in things like old age pension, subsidies on water, if there are any additional cash grants being provided
like the school cash
for
grants.
the school cash grants, any other grants that may be available for disabled, elderly, or any other vulnerable group, or if there are increases in those. And then I know another measure which people are really anticipating is to see it being, I guess, firmed up to about continued reliefs on vehicles and perhaps further changes that exist in that regime on taxes and duties on vehicles. I also look forward to some of the goods that perhaps would have been in consumption baskets that were moved from zero rated previously to exempt, and when the government changed in 2020, some of those goods were moved back to zero rated. Some still remain in the exempt basket, but perhaps also looking at moving some of them into zero rated. Those measures in a concrete way can help to impact on some of the prices that consumers would look at.
All right. All right. So finally, in one sentence, this is a pop quiz kind of thing for you. In one sentence, what's the most important objective Budget 2026 must achieve for Guyana?
Continued growth where consumers and the Guyanese citizenry can feel the power of the oil revenues in a stable, low inflation environment.
All right.
I would say that would pretty much surmise what a perfect budget 2026 could or should be able to do. Capture the oil revenues, have citizens of the country feel the impact of it, whilst simultaneously maintaining a stable economy that is characterized by low inflation.
Thank you very much, Richard, for such an insightful interview. Thank you so much for joining us on Ignite News Budget in Focus. Thank you for tuning in, and join us tomorrow as we cover the live presentation of the National Budget 2026.